I think there's a terrible angst on the land, a sense that something ugly is about to happen, an hour-to-hour feeling of nervous anticipation. Hunter S. Thompson wrote this years ago about the election of 1968, anticipating a victory by Richard Nixon. I thought about this sentence more and more in the last couple of weeks or months. It feels weird being at least somewhat engaged in political commentary at this specific moment in time. I struggled a bit finding something that I deem worth saying, something you might find useful to the current moment, but it didn't really work out. I already had read like 3 books for the last video I had planned before realizing that while I might find that topic interesting to talk about, the moment for that, isn't now. I want to be as efficient as I can with the time you guys give me, and I struggle to make that topic in particular worthy of that. Judging from the comments and messages I'm getting, quite a few in my audience share this feeling of tension when looking at US politics right now. Of course, the last 4 years or the time before that wasn't great. It did not feel particularly good reading the news then either, especially in situations where things could have gone a much different direction, like the US coming close to war with Iran, to name just one example. For many marginalized people in the US, that feeling is probably constant, given the current administration's approach to things like transgender rights, healthcare, or police brutality. I have the luck of currently not living in the country whose political landscape my channel largely revolves around, but of course, we're all connected in a way. For instance, when the US pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, our far-right party here in Germany took that as a signal to voice more of their climate change denialism talking points. In German politics, it is sometimes said that everything that happens in the US occurs in Germany too, only 10 years later. I seriously hope that doesn't ring true for the upcoming decade though. My apologies if I'm coming off as a bit of a doomer here, but seeing the most powerful person in the history of the planet denying to guarantee a peaceful transition of power, and priming his followers to doubt any election results that does not have him as the winner. To doubt is even putting it too mild. It's seeing them as de facto illegitimate. That has me wondering if this is what it feels like when American democracy is circling the drain. And that's what I wanted to talk about, because that feeling of nervous anticipation is justified. Although I should say, I don't think if there is a coup attempt, it will be like in the movies. Trump will not just declare the election illegitimate and have his political opponents arrested by the military or any scenario like that. I don't think that is very realistic. One reason for that is that for this movement, compared to other authoritarian ones that came to power, the veneer of democratic legitimacy is essential. In Italy or Germany, democracy was framed by the right as a weak and ineffective form of government. Many of them argued for what they called a guided democracy, where you still had a voice, but one guy would take care of the stuff that had to be dealt with immediately. That approach worked on many people because the circumstances were different. But today, Trump coming out saying democracy is a weak form of government, I don't think that would fly with the majority of Americans. It would fly with some, but not many. Framing yourself as the voice of a majority of Americans still is important, and we see that all the time when Trump talks about the silent majority, right? If there will be an attempt to steal this election by the Republicans, it requires above all uncertainty. Uncertainty about which votes are legitimate and uncertainty about the margins between the two candidates. This starts with who has the sovereignty of interpretation. Is there someone who can definitively say X candidate is ahead by this amount of points, and who most people believe? In the years before this election, Associated Press served this function. They had direct access to polling stations and gave a somewhat clear picture of the situation. This year, AP left the national election pool and is calculating the numbers directly for Fox and for the New York Times. Those left in the national election pool give their numbers to CNN and other TV stations. So the risk of different results making the rounds on election night is already higher than before. Republicans have, of course, been working overtime, delegitimizing mail-in ballots, and just to be clear on this, the reason why there is this much of a fuss about mail-in ballots is solely to create uncertainty. An authoritative report by the nonpartisan Brennan Center for Justice calculated the voter fraud rate in 3 elections between 0.0003% and 0.0025%. It is just a fig leaf for Republicans to launch a whole number of legal cases with the goal of throwing away votes in large numbers because more Democrats vote by mail than Republicans. They do this through purging voter rolls, tightening rules on provisional votes, banning the use of ballot drop boxes, or outlawing the counting of ballots postmarked by Election Day but arriving afterwards. Another tool is sabotaging the Postal Service by service cuts or upper management restructuring. To get a little more concrete on this, the Supreme Court just ruled that mail-in ballots in the state of Wisconsin only should be counted if they arrive before or on Election Day. If they are stamped on Election Day, that is not enough. The ruling in itself isn't that noteworthy, but the reasoning Justice Kavanaugh gave is. This comes courtesy of the New York Times. In his opinion, attached to the 5-3 ruling against the deadline extension in Wisconsin, Justice Kavanaugh wrote that Election Day mail-in deadlines were devised to avoid the chaos and suspicions of impropriety that can ensue if thousands of absentee ballots flow in after Election Day and potentially flip the results of an election. He added, those states also want to be able to definitively announce the results of the election on election night or as soon as possible thereafter. Justice Kavanaugh's statement mirrored in some ways Mr. Trump's efforts to suggest that only ballots counted by Election Day should decide the result, and more generally to push unfounded claims about widespread voter fraud. The words used by Justice Kavanaugh here are very telling, especially the section about mail-in ballots flipping the result of an election. It implies that mail-in ballots coming in after Election Day aren't part of the result. It is very concerning to say the least when you consider that in Wisconsin, 23,000 votes made the difference in 2016. A US election where the margins are very close and the results disputed is also not without precedent. In 1876, the Democratic candidate Samuel Tilden received 184 electoral votes, and the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes received 165, while 20 electoral votes from 4 states were unresolved. Both parties claimed victory in 3 of those 4 states, and the issue was only resolved through an informal deal between the parties. A more recent similar example would of course be the presidential election in 2000, where the Supreme Court stopped the recount of votes in Florida and thereby made George W. Bush the winner of the election. It doesn't invoke confidence in the Supreme Court thinking back to that disaster and knowing that 3 sitting Supreme Court justices worked for the side of Bush in that case. Roberts, Kavanaugh, and now Amy Coney Barrett. That is not an accident. The goal of creating this amount of uncertainty and calling mail-in ballots into question is delaying the calling of states until Safe Harbor Day, which is December 8th. If that happens, theoretically speaking, the states themselves might decide who receives their electoral votes. And in case you didn't know, Republicans hold a majority in Arizona, Florida, Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Although admittedly in a scenario like that it becomes pretty hazy because the governors can also appoint electors, it would be a nightmare. But before we go any further, this is the absolute worst case scenario. Biden might also win by such a significant margin that the Republicans are denied this election meddling route. That's entirely possible. Still, I also worry that a Biden landslide might cause many left-leaning people to stop caring about politics, which would be bad. The damage already done to American institutions will be a concern for the left for decades to come. We don't even have to mention the Supreme Court, just look at how many judges Trump put on the federal courts. This comes courtesy of a Financial Times article titled, "How Trump Has Already Transformed America's Courts." Mr. Trump's 4 years in office have allowed Republican lawmakers to dramatically reshape the US judicial system by installing right-wing judges at a pace almost unmatched in American history. Mr. Trump's judges, carefully selected for their ideological bona fides, have already begun to reshape US law in a more conservative direction on issues as wide-ranging as gun control, voting rights, environmental protections, abortion, and immigration. This judiciary will be a bulwark against progressive change in the US, be it on voting rights, labor, or social issues. It is not hard to imagine what difference a judiciary like this makes in an even more heated political climate. We don't even have to imagine, because that is a problem Germany also had in its interwar years. In fact, the first German democracy had a psychotically far-right judiciary. The stats on this are a bit iffy because a left-wing statistician collected them, but the general trend very much holds true. Richard Evans also brings this up in his Third Reich trilogy. Case in point, 22 political murders committed by left-wing offenders from 1919 to 1922 led to 38 convictions, including 10 executions and prison sentences, averaging 15 years apiece. By contrast, according to this statistician, the 354 political murders committed by right-wing offenders led to 24 convictions, no executions at all, and prison sentences averaging a mere 4 months apiece. 23 of those right-wing murderers who confessed to their crimes were acquitted by the courts regardless. That is not to say that all damage is already done and the election doesn't matter, because there is quite a material difference between a Biden and a Trump presidency, short-term or long-term. And if you can't see that difference, I think you are highly misguided, to say the least. However, I believe that this is mostly an online phenomenon. If you're looking for advice on what to do in one of the scenarios I just described, I'd highly recommend the work of the folks over on the Majority Report. They have discussed this in much more detail and also possible responses, including but not limited to a general strike. My apologies if you were hoping for something more positive regarding the election, but I'm looking at this as nervous as everyone else is. I do hope, though, that this video ages horribly and I can unlist it in a couple of weeks. One upside is that Biden is currently favored to win, and the scenario of a Trump landslide seems like an incredible long shot. But we'll see. Me personally, I will not be live streaming on election night like many others are, but there will be a watch party in my Discord where I and other like-minded folks will play video games, probably drink a lot, and watch the states come in. You can find the link for that in the description. That's about all I have, election-wise. One good thing did come out of my frustration with current US politics, though. I finally landed on a topic to kick off my history podcast with. Many political commentators who try to find a word for this sense of dread about upcoming political developments land on Weimar. I've lost count about how often I have seen someone compare the US right now to Germany before the Nazi Revolution. I made it myself even numerous times, including in this video. Historical comparisons are never perfect, but I do feel like it is worth having an idea of how German democracy died in the current political moment. So if you're looking for some additional content, you can check out my podcast called The Iron Dice. It's an immersive history podcast narrated by yours truly. The first series of episodes will take you through the political struggles of Weimar Germany, starting at the collapse of the old Bismarckian Empire at the end of World War I, over the open carnage in the streets of Berlin, all the way to the dawn of Germany's darkest hour. You can find that on my second YouTube channel or everywhere podcasts can be found. And with that, thank you sincerely for sticking with me, and especially to my patrons. The next video will be about German QAnon, which sadly is a thing that exists. I'll see you then, stay safe, and have a good one.